Welcome to the Wizards of Eem podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a bit of a hot topic, sandbox campaigns, and why we think they're amazing.
So let us first explain what a sandbox is.
What is a sandbox?
I mean, it's a mode of play where the players can essentially do anything. The world is their sandbox. They can go in any direction. They can pursue any story hook or plot or quest. And it differs from a more, linear campaign in that the GM isn't providing everything for the players. There's not some story that they're always following. There can be, but it's not the primary mode of play where players show up, they're like, all right, GM, what do you got for us? Where are we going today?
Right. And why we like this because we like the idea of having a living world that's going on outside of the actual game. So when the GM is running a game and the players jump in, they may encounter things that they don't expect. They may go down different avenues and bring the story into different places without actually disturbing that big linear story that the GM may have had in store for them.
So the first reason why sandboxes are awesome is because they give players freedom and agency. So in a sandbox, players have control over what they want to do, where they want to go. And this just allows for a more meaningful experience for a lot of players.
Yeah. And often people debate whether, a linear campaign with a story is better than a sandbox. And we're not here to debate if one is better than the other, just how each of them can be played and why we think sandboxes are really great and flexible.
Yeah. And unlike a linear campaign, sandboxes allow the players to drive the story. So they'll pursue rumors and quests and things on their own accord. They're not sitting around waiting for the DM or GM to tell them exactly what to do and where to go. So let's dive deeper into this. The first reason why sandboxes are awesome is because they, like we're saying, allow for more player freedom and agency. The players can take control over what they're doing, where they're going, which makes their choices just more meaningful over the course of the campaign.
Right. And in a game like Land of Eem, where a character's story and the relationships with each other are so core, and not to mention travel, a sandbox campaign can be an excellent tool to drive those relationships further by how they react to things that they didn't expect.
Right. And I've heard some detractors of sandbox say, well, a sandbox campaign can feel directionless. But I think that's only true if you're not allowing your players to have their own quests and goals. And so, in Land of Eem, we've got personal quests and there's tons of rumors and hundreds of rumors and quests to pursue. So as long as you are thinking about those things, you will have no shortage of directions to go.
Right. And when you encounter different characters and NPCs in the sandbox, like the Mucklands, for example, each of these characters have their own quests and motivations, and they may interact with other factions or other characters that exist in different locations. And that can be woven pretty easily into any storyline if you're playing, a campaign setting.
Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times, we start out a campaign, you guys are pursuing your personal quests off the bat, and then there's just a snowball effect of things that you run into and build
200 hexes later, we finally get back to where we were. So yeah, but I wouldn't call that directionless. I'd call that group led. The group finds itself.
There are so many directions. It's not directionless.
Yeah, right.
And on the GM side, this player agency really reduces GM prep time. And this is especially true when, you've prepared stuff beforehand or you're using a campaign setting.
I want to talk about a true sense of exploration. And I'm going to use the Mucklands as an example because the Mucklands has a couple of other resources that pair with it really well that create this sense of exploration. Land of Eem travel is really important. And whether you're playing a big campaign, it's got a lot of story, or you are just pursuing what's in front of you, travel is a way to actually create the sense of the journey, not just going from point A to fast forward at this location. In a great sandbox, lots of things can happen along the way. And one example that is kind of inspiring to me is Tolkien creates Middle Earth. He writes The Lord of the Rings. And then there's this section in Lord of the Rings where suddenly Frodo and the hobbits are encountering Tom Bombadil. And that's often criticized as being just, why is this here? How does this support the narrative? Well, Tolkien didn't care about any of that. He wanted to create an enigma in Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil exists in that location, and it's a fun offshoot adventure that brings us closer to the characters, and it's obviously like a little Easter egg.
I think the second reason why sandboxes are great is because they provide a true sense of exploration that you just can't get in other modes of play. But exploration is kind of notoriously hard to pull off in RPGs, or at least that's the misconception. Many prepped adventures funnel players down a certain path. Sometimes it's called railroading. And if they stray, off the beaten path, the GM is left scrambling. And so this can be a major problem, especially if the GM is just used to having all of this prep go off so swimmingly and then there's a hitch. What do you do? In a sandbox, that type of deviation is welcomed because you've got these locations in the sandbox that are already, prepped beforehand. And if the players go there, well, that's what they encounter.
Mucklands as an example. You're on your quest, you're doing your thing. The GM is taking you through these adventures and you're exploring what's around you. You're meeting characters that have their own agency. They've got their own personal quests. They've got their own things going on in these different locations. You're hearing rumors.
I always hear that D&D has no support for its exploration pillar, that part of the game. And I feel like that's because if players just stray from the adventure that the GM prepped, then everything's out the window. So players feel this obligation to just follow every breadcrumb that the GM lays out without kind of, maybe following what their character would do or that type of thing. So when exploration is on the table, players can really feel immersed and have this sense of wonder and discovery, just to see what's around the next corner. It's really kind of like in a sandbox video game where you get that feeling like Skyrim, oh my God, what if I went into this cave?
There's no loose ends. There can be, but really all those gaps in between that railroad adventure, it's all filled in. So a sandbox feels a lot more alive than a standard campaign with quests that are in a row. Land of Eem is the perfect example of the types of games that we play and how it unfolds in our own table, which is why we made it this way, because we made what we thought would be really fun to play. But having that living world is humongous, and it provides a ton of resources for a GM, especially if you stack all the resources on top of each other. Sure, you're exploring. Sure, you've got these locations and these NPCs and these rumors and these quest hooks. But then you throw in 1,000 random encounters that are all linked to these different locations and characters and conflicts happening throughout the region. And suddenly the place that you're playing becomes a character itself. And as you pursue your personal quest or your GM puts together the storyline, suddenly you can make it go as quick or as slow or as you'd like so that you can explore all of the Land of Eem or conclude that big epic story quest that you're after without it feeling artificial.
To expound on traveling, in a sandbox, travel suddenly matters. It's like a core part of the gameplay, which is really fun. I think in a lot of campaigns, people just gloss over travel like it's pointless. You just get from point A to point B. You just gloss over a 100-mile trek and just use a couple descriptions and you ate some rations or whatever, and we move on to the dungeon.
Yeah, you essentially teleport from one plot point to the next plot point with really minor encounters in between, if any.
Right. And this, we think, is a huge missed opportunity because the stories that we read in the fantasy genre are all about travel. It's the journey is the entire thing. Right. In our own stories that we write, that's the case. In stories that we love, like The Lord of the Rings, what if the Lord of the Rings, what if they weren't traveling?
We took the Eagles. We got there instantly. It was amazing. Really fulfilling story.
So when you have travel that matters, you suddenly just have all of this story come out of nowhere. The GM really doesn't have to prep anything if you're using random encounters. And we really recommend doing so in a sandbox because so many unexpected things will happen.
Yeah.
And random encounters are all not created equally. Some are really not helpful. You encounter 4 wolves.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got to have some sort of story baked into the encounter, some premise.
Whether it's like discovering something that's interesting or impactful to the journey itself, or meeting a challenge that maybe even sucks you into the local location. Suddenly these PCs are needed because this town is ransacked by bandits. It's all those different beats and all those different roadblocks that can actually end up being the things that players remember along the way. It's the journey, not the treasure. And that's why I think sandboxes are so amazing, because they engineer that feeling. It's these moments along the way that are going to be what are remembered and what really created great moments for the players and the GM.
Yeah, these random encounters aren't just filler. They can actually shift a game into a new direction that's really rewarding. They can add layers to it. I can't count the number of times a random encounter in our campaigns have just like added a new goal to everything.
Almost every time. Like almost every time they happen, it's like that way.
And it takes so here's how I view random encounters. People think that they're so hard to deal with as a GM because you have to put them in context, but they make GMing for me so much easier because they're just adding content. I view overland travel as sort of like a dungeon crawl.
Yeah, me too. And going back to what you just said, I think that random encounters without context are very difficult for a GM. It's like not a GM's best friend to run a random encounter if you don't have the context, but a sandbox creates context. So especially if those random encounters are connected in some way to that sandbox, it completely changes what the game feels like and plays like when it is alive around you, and that when that setting is a fluid thing with thought out elements to it. Because otherwise, I think it'd be tough to run. I totally agree. I think it'd be super tough to run a random encounters if you're on plot point B and they got to do this thing, and then you do a random encounter, and suddenly the players are super interested in everything going on with that one little kobold thief, and they follow him through the city, and they find yourself like having to generate all this stuff. Well, if the city exists, if the countryside exists, if that kobold exists and is connected to a faction that exists, all that can be pulled into the story and add a ton of richness that, makes it a delight to run because you've got those resources, but also super fun because the players wanted to pursue that. They got the fulfilling moment. They got to be able to pursue that and conclude that story thread.
And that's kind of what I meant by the dungeon crawl.
Yeah, right.
Because of all that context of the world, it's easy to put everything together like you're in a singular dungeon. You're playing in a dungeon, you run into kobolds who are a faction in this dungeon, and you play them against this, other faction. And that's what it's like when your random encounters are baked into the world.
Right. And so that said, the next element of why we think sandboxes are fantastic specifically is because they are GM's best friend.
Yeah. And what's really cool is once you're flowing in the sandbox, you really only have to think about the next session in front of you. You don't have to have a huge plan. You don't have to prep for hours and hours for a massive story that needs to be told in a certain way. With a setting like Land of Eem that has hundreds of locations and stuff like that, it's all there for you. This does take a bit of work if you're doing it all by yourself, but it's rewarding work that you can front load, and once it's there, you can rely on it.
Yeah, when we give presentations about the Land of Eem, or when we're doing like a school visit for Rickety Stitch or Dungeoneer's Adventures or something like that, it frequently comes up that we talk about having the Land of Eem as this giant setting is a piece of source material for us when we're writing individual stories about individual characters, because the setting is already alive. So when we choose to write another, Land of Eem series like Dungeoneer Adventures, we're able to pull from all of these elements that exist in this world so that we can focus the energy on the story-driven character elements, which is what a PC gets out of playing a game. Their individual quest and their combined group to fulfill whatever it is that they want to fulfill. That's a really rewarding element of it. And if you take the background work out of it for yourself, it can be really freeing to focus so much on those individual elements of the story and encounters that pay off that big grand narrative.
Yeah, it's a misconception that just because you're in a sandbox with this open world that there isn't a main storyline that the players are following. That's never been the case when we've done it. There's always some bigger looming threat or plot that is, tying everything together.
Yeah, totally. For us, like when we played our first campaign, it was the Sarpathi, which is an element of the actual Mucklands sandbox. But in our other campaigns, it was something else. Our current campaign, it's Krog. It's Krog, and it's like the main
Krog,
thing is
the evil
Krog
tycoon.
Krog, the Eagle Tycoon, who's taken over the Mucklands and making a gumball empire. It sounds ludicrous when I say it right now, but that's the main plot. But we're still playing in the sandbox, and it'll be the same way for when we release the Underlands sandbox. There will be something baked in, like an overarching threat that's baked in. But then any overarching story that the GM wants to tell, that's fair game. The world's just there for them to play in.
Yeah. Like what we're really talking about is bringing this narrative and, sandbox play together in one thing. It's not.
Yeah, they don't have to be exclusive of each other. You can definitely have a narrative campaign utilizing a sandbox. The sandbox just represents, and I've said this a million times, but like it represents that living world, that setting that's baked so that you can put your story on top of it, just like we do, like with Dungeoneer Adventures 3 or whatever. It's the same type of mechanism and tool that allows for a richer game with lots of resources. And who says you got to use everything that's in? When you use whatever it is you want to use, that's the whole point of it.
What is really cool, I think, is that the world is alive. And so from an example from our own campaign right now is that your conflict with Krog the Tycoon directly led to the complete change of one of the cities called Junktown.
Yeah.
So because you guys didn't succeed, aborted your plans in that town and left, Krog has taken over and it's become basically Krogtown.
It's totally changing the dynamics of what's going on in the setting because now we can't return to that place and have it be the same. It's changed. There's actually like little nuggets in the Mucklands that suggest how these things can happen. Like there's timelines for particular quests. If you do choose to pursue that one quest, but don't perform it in time, something happens. The world changes.
I think that's one of the coolest things about a sandbox.
Same.
Like if the PCs go one way or the other, that means, this villain has progressed their plans because they weren't thwarted.
We joke about that all the time. It's like, well, he's going to be a campaign villain now because we really screw over somebody or defeat them, but they get away. And it's like, well, they're going to come back to haunt us. That's just like the classic PC paranoia.
Yeah. But it just like adds so many layers that I think you miss out on if you're just going down this, singular adventure path.
Totally. Obviously, we're huge fans of sandboxes or else we wouldn't write them all the time.
Yeah. And I just feel like there's this subsect of the TTRPG community who sort of rags on sandboxes sometimes or hex crawl.
But there's a reason that it exists. And I think it boils down to it just being such a tremendous resource for GMs to pull from. It's all about utilizing the resources, not necessarily thinking that it's always going to be this directionless, player-led something or other. It just pays off when the player's interested. It just gives you context for that character or that location or that encounter. And that's why I think it's such a useful tool because I haven't GM'd in a while actually, but when I did GM, that was always a challenge for me because I found myself just like doing all kinds of prep for all the potential possibilities that could happen. If I could front load this so that we could just focus on the game, then it would be a lot easier. And ultimately it led to the creation of Land of Eem and the Mucklands and soon to be the Underlands.
Yeah. If you watch our actual play, one of the least kept secrets is that I don't prep at all. I spend no time, seriously. Zero
cannot
time.
stress this enough. We don't even know what happened last week sometimes because we're so busy during the week. And thanks to George, shout out Georgie for keeping the minutes and keeping us on track. But it's all about having ultra resources that you can pull through and make your own.
And obviously I benefit from being one of the co-authors of this, so I know it well. But I think just spending a half an hour to an hour like prepping with a sandbox is enough. I know some people spend hours and hours
or weeks. We've gotten comments of people that have been like, I've been working on my campaign for 6 months. I've wrote all these whatever, and that's fun. Like Ben and I we're definitely going to put out some sort of a story campaign eventually, but it'll be layered on top of a sandbox so that it's really easy to run.
And GM prep burnout is a real thing. That's maybe one of the number one reasons behind scheduling, maybe. why campaigns just sort of die. It's because the GM is saddled with all of this work that they have to do in between the sessions.
Right.
And it's kind of a thankless job. So having resources and just like the entire world to support you is really great.
Yeah, totally. And I can definitely vouch for the fact that because the Mucklands sandbox setting exists for us, we've played more than ever because it's there, because it exists. We've had how many 3 campaigns in the Mucklands sandbox?
Yeah, I mean, we're in like 160 episodes or something.
Like 160 sessions that we played over the last couple of years. There's a ton of TTRPGing. If you do the math, that's like a lot of gaming. And we haven't even finished the sandbox, but that's cool because now we got the Underlands coming and I can't wait to, check out the fungal jungle and all those, it'll be great.
Yeah, I'm excited for the Underlands.
I'm excited too. So there you have it. That's why we think sandboxes are fantastic and they're perfect for our kind of play. They may not be perfect for your play, but we definitely recommend to give it a shot because if you're a GM and you do lots of prep or you're stressed out, it's worth checking it out because it can be a huge relief and also just open up a lot of opportunity for players to be rewarded when they want to pursue things.
Indeed. So go forth, create your sandboxes, check out the Mucklands.
Check out the Mucklands, the Land of Eem Mucklands sandbox if you haven't already. And we would love your support on the Underlands, which is imminently coming to Kickstarter, if not already.
Indeed. So happy gaming, folks, and we'll see you next time.
Farewell.